Okay, welcome back to another Mission Citizen lesson. Again, I'm Kala, and today we're going to be doing lesson 6, which is on rights and amendments. Okay, so as always, if you have not yet gone to our website and printed out our quiz and also the note sheet for lesson 6, go ahead and do that now. You can find it at www.missioncitizen.org. Go to the Student Resources tab and then scroll until you hit lesson 6, print out lesson 5 quiz and lesson 6 notes, and then go ahead and complete the lesson 5 quiz based on your memory from the last lesson, prior knowledge. You could also use your notes from lesson 5 if you would like. And then once you're done with that, unpause this video and I'm going to start going over the answers to that quiz. Okay, so I'll give you a minute to pause and now I'm going to move on. Okay, so for question number 1 on the quiz, there's a lot of different answers you could have for this one. So the judicial branch reviews laws or explains laws, resolves disputes, or decides if a law goes against the Constitution. Any of those answers should work. Anything restating the same meaning also works, as long as you're getting across the same message. For question number 2, the highest court in the United States is the Supreme Court. For number 3, there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. And for number 4, John Roberts is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the moment. Okay, oh yeah, that was a really short quiz. Okay, so now it's time to go ahead and get out your note sheet once you have all those answers down. And we are going to start talking about the new information. So we'll start with amendments to the Constitution. And remember, as usual, you want to be taking notes on the information in bold in the blanks on your note sheet. Okay, so an amendment is a change or addition to the Constitution. It's pretty difficult to get an amendment added to the Constitution. In order to do that, you need to get it voted on by both Congress and state legislatures. So both houses of Congress need to adopt it with a 2/3 vote, which is, it's pretty hard to get 2/3 of Congress to agree on much of anything. Or you need 2/3 of state legislatures to request a convention where the amendment will be passed, and then after that happens, 3/4 of state legislatures or conventions in 3/4 of the states need to ratify the amendment. So it is really, really difficult to get an amendment passed, and because it's so difficult, there are only 27 amendments to the US Constitution in about 200 years of being a country, only 27, so it is a rare event when an amendment is passed. And part of that 27 actually is going to be the first 10 amendments which were passed immediately after the Constitution was passed, so really only 17 after the Constitution was passed. It's really a rare thing when the Constitution gets amended. So speaking of those 10 amendments that were passed right after the Constitution was ratified, those 10 amendments make up the Bill of Rights. So the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are known as the Bill of Rights, and they're called the Bill of Rights because they explain the fundamental rights of anybody living in this country. So these amendments were ratified or approved by 3/4 of the state legislatures by 1791, which was soon after the Constitution was ratified in 1788. Okay, so make sure you get Bill of Rights written down on your note sheet. Move on. So just a little bit of history. Many states were worried that the Constitution did not limit the federal government's power enough. They, again, had experience with a tyrannical king who was exercising way too much power and controlling the colonists' daily lives far too much. So they were really worried about a federal government that was really powerful and could be able to abuse its power in the same way the king had abused his power over them, the King of England. And so this made them hesitant to approve the Constitution. So as a compromise, James Madison wrote the Bill of Rights in order to protect the fundamental rights of the people, so that these people that were worried, or these states that were worried, could feel comforted that the government would have to abide by this Bill of individual rights and would not be able to abuse its power as the king had. So the First Amendment of the Constitution prevents, first of all, what it does is it prevents government from establishing a national religion, like England had an established national religion, the Church of England, so the colonists wanted to move away from that. And it also protects freedom of expression, which includes freedom of religion, which means you can choose to practice any religion or no religion at all. It also protects freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. Freedom of assembly just means basically freedom to meet together in a group, so like go to a protest or just have a club meeting, anything like that. Any sort of group of people can gather. And also freedom to petition the government, which is basically the freedom to ask the government to make some change. Okay, so moving on to the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms. It means that individuals can own weapons like guns, although there can be certain limitations that are placed on owning guns or other weapons. But in general, Americans have the right to own weapons. Okay, the Third Amendment. So the Third Amendment prohibits the government from forcing civilians to allow soldiers to live in their homes. So you might remember from a previous lesson that one of the reasons for the Revolutionary War was the fact that British soldiers were staying in colonists' homes without their consent. And obviously that is a big inconvenience to the colonists. It was a big invasion of privacy. So after the colonists won independence, when they were building their new nation and creating their constitution, they wanted to make absolutely certain that their new government would not be able to do the same thing. So now that doesn't really happen anymore. We don't have wars fought on American soil in modern America, so it is not really an issue that soldiers will be staying in our homes. So it's a little bit irrelevant, but it is still there in case the situation were ever to arise. Okay, now the Fourth Amendment. So the Fourth Amendment states that the government cannot arrest or search people or search their homes or their property without a warrant and probable cause. So a warrant is like a piece of paper signed by a judge that says, yes, this person, this police officer, whatever, has a valid reason for needing to search this person or needing to arrest this person. There's sufficient evidence to believe that maybe this person committed a crime. And the Fourth Amendment has been interpreted by courts to protect a variety of different forms of privacy over many things beyond just yourself and your home, including cars, cell phones, digital documents, etc. Okay, moving on to the Fifth and Sixth Amendments. These amendments deal with people who have been accused of crimes and the rights that they have. Some of these rights include the right to remain silent when you are being questioned by the government. So the government cannot force you to speak while you are being arrested, or if you are in a trial, they can't force you to testify. You have the right to choose not to tell the government anything if you were under suspicion of committing a crime. You also have the right to fair treatment before the government imprisons you, executes you, or takes your property. The government has to follow certain established, fair, consistent procedures if they are trying to do any of those things to you. You also have the right to be repaid if the government takes your property. So sometimes the government will seize property, say to build a highway, for example. They need a big chunk of land that's owned by, various people. Maybe there's like a neighborhood and people are living in this area that the government wants to build a highway. The government can actually seize your property, supposedly for the public good, but they do need to repay you if they do that. They can't just take your house and be like, sorry. You also have the right to a quick and public trial by an impartial jury. So you cannot be forced to spend 10 years in a long, long trial. Trials cannot be, they can't be secret so that the public wouldn't be able to ensure that the trial is fair. And the jury has to be impartial. They can't be a group of really biased people who wouldn't be able to make a fairly objective decision about your case. You also have the right to a lawyer regardless of whether you can afford one. If you can't afford one, the government will assign you a lawyer. Okay, so moving on to the 7th and 8th Amendments. These also protect rights that are related to the legal system. So the 7th Amendment guarantees that you can have a jury in federal civil trials, and the 8th Amendment protects people accused or convicted of crimes from excessive bail, excessive fines, or cruel or unusual punishment. So cruel or unusual punishment basically means that the government cannot punish you in a way that is really like disproportionate to the circumstances. So they can't execute you, for example, for a speeding ticket. That would be totally out of line. They can't give you a life sentence for jaywalking because that would be both cruel and unusual. Some people argue that things like the death penalty, which is still practiced in the US, is a form of cruel and unusual punishment that shouldn't be allowed. That's currently still up for debate. The Supreme Court has not ruled to ban the death penalty because it's cruel or unusual punishment, but there are definitely people who believe that. Okay, last two. So the 9th and 10th Amendments were designed to address the framers' concerns that the Constitution was giving the federal government too much power and that the federal government would be able to deny the people their rights. So the 9th Amendment says that we have more rights that have not been specifically listed in the Constitution. So the government cannot tell us you do not have that right because it isn't in the Bill of Rights. Humans have a lot of different rights, and the framers knew that they would not be able to list every single one, so they kind of left themselves this out to say, there are more rights, these are just the ones we listed. And then the 10th Amendment says that all powers that have not been specifically given to the federal government either belong to state governments or the people. So that way the federal government can't just assume that it has the power to do anything it wants. It can actually only do the things that the Constitution has specifically told it can do. Okay, so now that we've gone over the Bill of Rights, I know that was a lot of information and you didn't have to take a lot of notes on that, but I think it's important to know about the Bill of Rights because after all, those are your fundamental rights as a person living in this country. So it's important to know what those are so that you know if the government is respecting them. But now that we've gotten through the Bill of Rights, we're going to start talking about voting amendments. So voting is a central part of living in a representative democracy as we do in America. And there are actually 4 amendments to the Constitution that have to do with the right to vote. And remember, there are only 27 amendments, so that is a lot of amendments on one topic. Those amendments include the 15th, the 19th, and the 26th amendments. And we're going to go over each of them. So the 15th Amendment states that the right to vote can't be denied based on race. So for a long time in this country, from the time that Africans were first taken from Africa and sold as slaves in this country, African Americans were denied the right to vote. Until after the Civil War, slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment stated that African Americans were full and equal citizens. So after those 2 amendments, the 15th Amendment stated that African Americans also had the right to vote now. An important thing to keep in mind is that even though the 15th Amendment gave African Americans or anybody of a race other than white the right to vote in this country, there have still been a lot of other efforts to prevent Black people in particular from voting, such as like literacy tests, which were basically a test you had to take that was designed to be impossible to pass. And if you didn't pass the test, you couldn't vote. There were also poll taxes, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. And those are like fees that you have to vote. And because African Americans had just been forced into slavery for so many years, many didn't have the money to pay a poll tax to vote. So that was a big barrier. So it's important to keep in mind that although the 15th Amendment did, on paper, give the right to vote to people of all races, that wasn't actually true for a long time. And you could even argue today still isn't fully true. Okay, the 19th Amendment. 19th Amendment states that the right to vote cannot be denied based on sex. So it was adopted in 1920 as a result of the women's suffrage movement that had been going on for a full 100 years since the 1820s. Women's suffrage is kind of a negative sounding phrase, but it actually just means like women's right to vote. So Susan B. Anthony was a really key figure in this movement. She was a women's rights activist who fought for both women's rights and civil rights during this time, up until the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. Okay, so now the 24th Amendment. So you remember those poll taxes I was talking about? The 24th Amendment prohibits poll taxes or taxes that must be paid in order for you to vote. So again, poll taxes were designed to make it difficult for African Americans to vote, especially in southern states, but they also just prevented poorer citizens of all races from voting. And they were just a barrier that was designed to preserve the power of wealthy white people, particularly in the South, but to some extent across the country. So the 26th Amendment is actually somewhat recent. It was adopted in 1971 during the Vietnam War, and what it did was lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. So the reason the 26th Amendment was proposed was because men as young as 18 were being drafted and forced to fight in the Vietnam War, but they didn't even have the power to vote for representatives that either supported or opposed the war. So they really had no say in whether we were fighting in that war, but they were still being forced to fight and die in the war. And during that time, the slogan, "old enough to fight, old enough to vote," became very common as an argument for kind of the injustice of being able to die for your country without being able to vote in your country. Okay, so those are the 4 voting rights amendments, and now we're going to get into the civil rights movement and some of the rights that came out of that. So the civil rights movement mostly happened in the 1960s to the 1970s, and its goal was to end racial discrimination and promote equal rights for people of color. A leader in the civil rights movement was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You'll see him on the right down there. So Dr. King fought for civil rights and worked for equality for all Americans. So make sure you get that one written down. Okay, so now that we've talked about the civil rights movement, the voting rights movement, the voting amendments, the Bill of Rights, we are going to go ahead and go over the information we learned with a little quiz. So as always, if you know the answer, you can shout it out, you can write it down, you can just think of it in your head, and then, just do that every time I say a new question. Okay, so our first question, what is an amendment? An amendment is a change to the Constitution or an addition to the Constitution. How many amendments does the Constitution have? The Constitution has 27 amendments. What do we call the first 10 of those amendments? We call them the Bill of Rights. What is one right or freedom that we can find in the First Amendment? You could say freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, right to assembly, and right to petition the government. So any of those would work. What is freedom of religion? Freedom of religion means that you can choose to practice any religion or not practice any religion at all. There are 4 amendments in our Constitution about who can vote. Describe one of those amendments. So you could say the 5th, actually I'll give you a bit more time. Think of that one. Okay, so you have the 15th Amendment, which states that citizens of any race can vote. The 19th Amendment, which states that citizens of any gender can vote. The 24th Amendment, which says that citizens don't have to pay to vote or have to pay a poll tax to vote. And finally, you have the 26th Amendment, which states that citizens 18 and older can vote instead of 21 and older. So you're going to have to be able to name and describe any one of those 4 amendments. It's kind of a longer question than most of them. What did Susan B. Anthony do? Susan B. Anthony fought for women's rights and fought for civil rights. Either of those would work. What movement tried to end racial discrimination? The Civil Rights Movement. What did Martin Luther King Jr. do? You could say he fought for civil rights, or you could say he worked for equality for all Americans. Okay, so now we're going to get into rights of U.S. citizens and residents in this country. So rights of everyone in the United States include freedom of expression, which involves freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition the government, freedom of religion, and the right to bear arms. And these rights belong to everybody in this country, regardless of your citizenship status. So anybody has these core rights. There are also some responsibilities that come along with being a U.S. citizen, as well as some rights that only belong to U.S. citizens. So rights that are only for U.S. citizens include voting in federal elections and running for federal office. So those are not open to anybody who lives in this country. You do have to be a citizen to vote or run for office. And then some responsibilities also only belong to U.S. citizens. Again, voting in federal elections, that could be considered both a right and a responsibility, as well as serving on juries. So you do not have to do that if you are a U.S. citizen, but if you are not a U.S. citizen, but if you are a U.S. citizen, that is one of your duties to this country. Okay, how can Americans participate in democracy? So the really core one is voting. When you become a citizen, you can participate in democracy by voting. This is probably the most powerful way to influence who represents you in government and how you are represented. Voting also allows you to hold elected officials accountable by letting them know with your vote whether you believe in their platform or whether you do not and you believe in somebody else's platform. And that sends a message to politicians beyond the one you're voting on about what kind of positions they can have and still be, elected into office, what kind of positions the citizens of this country believe in. Serving on a jury. So as a citizen, you may be asked to serve on a jury. If you are unavailable to do this, you can request to be dismissed, but otherwise it is your responsibility to go and serve on that jury. As a member of a jury, you listen to a trial and then you ultimately make a fair decision about the outcome of the case, whether it is a criminal case or a civil case. Now, I know a lot of people dread serving on juries, but it really is important that juries are made up of ordinary, everyday citizens who can empathize with the people who are at trial and who can try to understand their circumstances rather than decisions just being made by powerful people. Okay, running for office. So as a citizen, you have the right to run for office. You can run for local, state, or federal government. However, there's one exception. Only people who are born in the U.S. can run for president, but any other federal government position, people who were not born here but became citizens in whatever way can run for president. There are also many more ways to participate in democracy. Some of them are lower commitment than things like voting, serving on a jury, and running for office. So you can also participate by joining a political party, helping with a political campaign, joining a civic group, joining a community group, giving an elected official your opinion on an issue. So that can be just by meeting with them. It's possible to schedule a meeting with your elected official. If you see them in some sort of informal setting and you just pull them aside and give them your opinion, you can do that. You can call them or write them a letter. You could send them an email. Those are all good ways to give an elected official your opinion. And that brings me to calling your senators and representatives. When you call your senators and representatives, it is very likely that your senator or representative will not be the one who answers the phone. They're pretty busy. They've got a lot of other stuff going on. But one of their staff members will pick up and they will write down whatever your concern is. Whatever issue you disagree with or agree with or want to see your senator or representative fighting for, they will make a note of that and they will add it to a list of other people's opinions, and they will take that into account when it comes to your senator or representative will take that into account when it comes to how they vote and what positions they take. Because ultimately, they are there to represent you, they are there to represent their constituents, and again, their goal is to stay in office and to not do anything that will cause their constituents to vote for somebody else. So they really will take what you say into account. Another good way to participate in democracy is by publicly supporting or opposing an issue or policy. So if you have any sort of public support, or even if you just have a social media account, or have conversations with the people you know, talking to people about your beliefs on certain issues or policies can be a really good way to kind of spread the word about what you believe and hopefully convince other people to believe that too. You can also write to a newspaper. So newspapers accept like op-eds or so opinion editorials or letters to the editor, basically just giving your thoughts on some issue that the newspaper wrote about. That's a good way to get your voice heard as well. Okay, so now we're going to talk about political parties. So a political party is a group of people who share similar views. In the US, there are a lot of political parties, but there are only really two that are powerful and that are, big forces in our politics, and those are the Democrats and the Republicans. You'll see on the right here, there's an elephant and a donkey. Those are the symbols for the two parties. The Republicans are the elephant, the Democrats are the donkeys. They also both have their own color. Democrats are blue, Republicans are red. If somebody's in the middle, they're purple. Get it? Because it's like blue and red mixed together. So anyways, those are the two main parties. And then we also have some smaller parties like the Libertarians and the Green Party, but they are not very present in our politics. There are a lot of other countries with many political parties that actually play a pretty significant role in government, but in the US there are really just these two. So if you're in one of these two parties, you can participate in primary elections. If you don't know what a primary election is, basically before the general election where one Democrat and one Republican are fighting against each other, both the Democrats and the Republicans will have their own little election where they choose between different Democrats and different Republicans which person will represent the party in what's called the general election. So if you're in a party, you can choose who it is in your party that ultimately represents you in the general election against the other party. Okay, so when you become a US citizen, there are certain promises you have to make to the US government. So these promises include giving up loyalty to other countries, defending the Constitution and the laws of the United States, obeying the laws of the United States, serving in the US military if you're needed, serving, which is just doing important work for the nation, again if needed, and also being loyal to the United States. So some of these might sound pretty doable, like obeying our laws, but some of them, like giving up loyalty to your home country, might sound a bit extreme. This doesn't really mean that you have to totally give up any sort of connection to the place that you were born or the place you grew up or another country that you have lived. It really just means that you are accepting the United States as your country now. And really the goal here is to make sure that people are loyal to the US and are not going to commit any sort of treason against this country. So you can still have attachment to another country. That's not what this means. It's just you do need to be loyal to the United States and to not betray it, which it's pretty unlikely that most people would consider that, but it's still part of the promises you have to make when you become a US citizen. Okay, so now that we've gotten through that part, what are two rights of everyone living in the United States? Go ahead and call this one out or write it down or think it in your head if you know. You could say freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition the government, freedom of religion, or the right to bear arms. Any of those. Name one right that only belongs to US citizens. You could say voting in federal elections or running for federal office. What is one responsibility that is only for US citizens? Again, we have serving on a jury, and again, we have voting in a federal election. What are two ways that Americans can participate in their democracy? You can vote, you can run for office, you can serve on a jury, you can join a political party, help with a campaign, join a civic group, join a community group, give an elected official your opinion, call your senators and representatives, publicly support or oppose an issue or policy, or you can write to a newspaper. Any two of those. Okay, what are the two major political parties in this country? The Democratic and Republican parties. What is one promise you make when you become a US citizen? You promise to give up loyalty to other countries, defend the Constitution and laws of the United States, obey the laws of the United States, serve in the US military if needed, serve the nation if needed, be loyal to the United States. Okay, those are the promises you make when you become a US citizen. So now that we have gone over the quiz, we've gone over all the new material, now we're going to get into a citizen tip. So our tip this week is know your rights. So you might be asking, why should I know my rights? Why is that important? Why should I do that? It sounds like a lot of work. So the purpose of the United States government should be to protect your rights. However, citizens and non-citizens alike must be aware of their rights so that they can hold the government responsible for making sure they are protected. This is part of what's called the social contract. The government protects our rights in exchange for us giving it the power to govern us. So where do your rights come from? A lot of your rights, as we've discussed, come from the US Constitution. So the original Constitution and all the add-ons, the Bill of Rights and all the other amendments. You also have rights that come from the Oregon Constitution, which protects you against any sort of abuse of power by the state government, as well as documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is an international document created by the United Nations that establishes certain fundamental rights that all people have that you can expect your government to respect. And many of the rights that you can find in these documents apply to all people, not just citizens. Some are specific to citizens, like voting, but many are applicable to everybody, and everybody can expect those rights to be respected. So there are some helpful organizations if you feel that the government is infringing or violating your rights, like the ACLU, which supports civil rights, and it specifically focuses on the legal side of that. Here's a helpful link if you want information about your rights if you're being questioned about your immigration status. There are other organizations like Basic Rights Oregon, which focuses on LGBTQ+ equality. There's also the Community Alliance of Tenants, which advocates for renters, tenants, to hold their landlords responsible for safe, affordable, and comfortable housing. And in addition, there's Legal Aid Services of Oregon, which is a nonprofit that provides free legal help to protect families and individuals of low incomes. So those are all good organizations to know if you feel your rights are being violated. But the first step to that is knowing your rights in the first place. So that is why this is our citizen tip of the week. Okay, so now if we were in a class, we would have a little discussion about what are you most excited for about being a US citizen. But because we are doing this virtually, we're going to skip past that. And I will just remind you, if you have any questions, you can send us an email at missioncitizen@gmail.com, and we will get back to you, get your question answered as soon as we can. But thank you for watching this video. I hope it was helpful in learning a little bit more about your rights in this country and the amendments to the Constitution that include many of those rights. Okay, thanks for watching.